Okay, so we have both of our image directions, and it's time to apply the masthead to our covers. So let me go into Illustrator and pull up the final masthead design that we created. Before I pull this into Photoshop, I first want to just clean it up a little bit because we kind of have these little white rectangles that we applied to create these little cutouts, but we want that to be part of the actual shape and not just a white rectangle sitting on the black. Because if we put this into our masthead, if I just went ahead and copied this into Photoshop, okay, those little white rectangles are actually going to show up in the final design, and that's not what we want. We want that to be a hole in the actual vector itself. So let's cancel that out, go back into Illustrator, and to actually subtract that out, I can use Pathfinder. So let me select the type, because first I want to convert this from live type over to outlines. So I can do that by hitting Shift Command O, or just going up to type and down to create outlines. Okay, so that's going to convert this to a vector object. Let me go ahead and ungroup these letters because then I can work with them individually. And if I just select both the T and the white rectangle at the same time, I can go over and use the Pathfinder tool. Okay, and if you don't have that, you can always add it through Window. Okay, and with the Pathfinder tool, I can use -front to subtract the front object, which is the white rectangle, from the rear object, which is the T. Okay, so -front. Now that is an actual cutout from the T itself. And I can do the same with the other T as well. So -front, remember I have to have both of them selected, and the white rectangle has to be in front of the T, which it is. Okay, and so that is going to work just fine. Okay, so this is ready to go. Let's go ahead and copy it. So I'm going to select all the letters, Command C to copy it into the clipboard. And then let's go back to Photoshop and just paste it right into our document. Okay, and when you paste it, it's going to paste it in as a smart object. You get a chance to sort of position it, so the transform tool will automatically come up. You can just sort of position it wherever you want. I'm going to position it, in the top third, which is where you want it to go. Okay, cool. So it's a little bit hard to read right now. I'm definitely having, some readability issues. One thing that I think is going to be a better solution is to actually put it behind the figure itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and put it behind, because remember, a lot of times, having that interaction is actually a little bit cooler than just having the text sort of sit on top. It creates a little bit more of a dynamic. And since we already have the figure cut out, okay, all we have to do is put that layer behind that first layer, and it's going to go right behind. Okay, we can also play around with the color of this, and since this is a smart object, you can see it's a smart object because of this little icon. Smart objects are sort of like files within files. Okay, so if I actually double click on the thumbnail here, what it's going to do is it's going to open up the smart object in Illustrator. Okay, so I still have that original document, but it opened up a separate Illustrator file where this vector art is contained. And anything I change in this original file is going to also change in Photoshop. Okay, so if I wanted to make this a different color, let's say I wanted to make it kind of like blue instead of black, okay, I can make that change. And then when I save this file, or if I close it and then click Save, okay, when I go back to Photoshop, it'll make that same change in the Photoshop document as well. So that's the way that smart objects work. They're actually sort of like linked files within files. And if you create a smart object from Illustrator, when you double click and edit that smart object, it'll bring you back in Illustrator to make those edits. If you create a smart object out of a Photoshop file, it'll do the same, but it'll actually open up that separate file in Photoshop. And again, any changes that you make to that object will automatically happen to the base file as well. Okay, the other way we can change this color around is to use the blending modes options. So this might be something that you played around with already. You can always access it just by double clicking the sort of empty space next to that layer. Okay, so I'm going to double click this area over here. When I do that, I get this layer style panel. Okay, in the layer style panel, there's a bunch of different options, and one of those options is just a simple color overlay. So this is a way to, using an effect, basically change the color of any kind of object. Okay, so I'm going to select color overlay. Once I click that check mark, it's going to apply that effect. Then I can just click on this fill area and select any color I want. So if I want pure black, I can select that. I think black is a good choice in this case because we need it to work both over the white and over the red. Okay, and there's a lot of black parts in the image as well, like the brim of this hat is very rich black, and it's going to sort of match that color. Okay, so I'm going to select a black color overlay and click OK. And there we go, that looks pretty good. So it's not really possible to read the actual masthead, but again, remember that is a strategy that people often use in masthead design to cover up the masthead and create that interaction. So in this case, I'm totally fine with the fact that I can't quite see what's happening in the masthead. Okay, let's move over to our second image idea. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and copy our masthead into that space. So hitting Command C. Then I'll go back to Photoshop and hit Command V. Okay, and when I paste it, you can see it's asking me whether I want a smart object. I'm going to go ahead and select that. That's the default option, and it's usually the one to do because you can, like I said, always go back and change that smart object, which is really powerful. Okay, so I'm going to have that selected. And then let's just sort of position it towards the top. There we go. Okay, so you can see in this case, the text is really hard to see, so I think white is probably a better color for this over the black. Okay, so again, I can either double click on this to open up that smart object, and I can change it in here to white. Okay, and then when I close this and save it, when I go back to the Photoshop document, it'll change to white. Or I can use the color overlay, and again, you can access that by just double clicking in this zone over here. Okay, so white is looking pretty good, but it's still a bit hard to read. So one thing we might do in this case is sort of apply a slight filter to the image or to the top part of this area to just get the white to be a little bit more readable. Okay, so one thing we could do is right underneath that text layer. Okay, so I have this layer selected right underneath the text layer. I'm going to go down and create an adjustment layer and a solid color adjustment layer and just fill that with black. Okay, so pure black adjustment layer, and then if I just turn down the opacity of that layer, okay, so instead of 100%, maybe I go down to 18%. You can see that when I turn that off and on, it's just giving a little bit more readability to our masthead. Okay, so it's just a little bit easier to read that. Another option is I could turn that down even further, and then I can apply another little layer at the top. Okay, so if I click New, create a new layer here, and then I'm just going to work with a really big broad brush. Okay, so if you hold down Control and Alt, you can just create a really, really soft big brush. Okay, so I have hardness at 0%, and diameter is really large. Okay, and what I can do on this new layer is just paint using the black color, and I have my flow set really low. Let's go even lower than that. Okay, I can just sort of paint in a little bit behind that masthead. Okay, so I'm basically just darkening the top of the image. If I turn this off and on, you can see that I've created just sort of a darkening effect at the top, and that's helping me, read that masthead even without darkening the rest of the image. Okay, so that might be something that you have to do in order to get your text to be really readable, especially if you're working with an image that's a little bit busier. That's more of a challenge. So you might have to brush in a little bit of dark to kind of get that text to read in white or whatever color text you're working with. But that looks pretty good, and these two items are ready to submit for my drafts.